Good evening, everybody. This is Marty from Dawgs blog with tonight's podcast of the Frank Carson trial on November 8th, 2018. Judge was on the bench at 1:47 this afternoon, and if you listen to the noontime report, you'll know that we're coming back at 1:30 for Charlie ODELL to listen to the recordings of his interviews with Corey Brown, which was, I forget, it was in 2013. Kurt Bunches was in November of 2013. He apparently was a little confused about some things. They kept refreshing his recollection. And so he wanted to listen to the recordings, and he listened to the full recordings of both interviews. It took over an hour, I believe. The jury didn't come up until I got it here somewhere. I wrote it down. 3:25. So the jury was supposed to come up around 2:30. They came up at 3:25. So what does that mean? That means they had 35 minutes of court time this afternoon. This is how this case is going. So I wrote a lot of notes on this recording, and it was pretty interesting. Charlie ODELL is finally admitting that Michael COOLEY made some admissions in this thing. And Kurt Bunch started out in this interview saying, Kurt Bunch says, "You all reached out to me. What happened?" Now this was actually, I believe it was Corey Brown that was doing this interview, and I believe it was at the sheriff's office or the DA's office, one of the two. It was in a interview room setting. I saw Marlissa's Ferrer computer, but it was a small picture on it, and it looked like it was an interview room. Charlie ODELL was talking about Mike COOLEY. He had known him for years. Mike COOLEY had some antiques to sell in Delhi. He was selling these things all over. Mike COOLEY's admitted on the stand that he's ripping stuff off. Charlie ODELL is saying he was massively ripping things off. Mike COOLEY kept taking more and more antiques. And Corey Kaufman, he said, knew a dealer or a buyer of antiques in Sonora, and he took some antiques up to Sonora, and he was supposed to come back with the money for Mike COOLEY. He never did. He never came back to Mike COOLEY's house with that money. He said there was several thousand dollars owed. Mike COOLEY said that he needed Charlie ODELL to help with the thefts. Keith Hobbs, who is Eula Keys' son, said they were going to Frank Carson's property and steal everything not nailed down, that they have been for some time. One day Frank Carson showed up over at the house, at Mike COOLEY's house, looking at the cars, through the cars. Charlie ODELL had two cars over at COOLEY's house. Linda Sue Burns' car was also there. And he saw Frank Carson looking in a car. He was actually inside the car, he says, bent over inside the car, had his head in a car, and he went up and kicked him in the backside. Later on, he says, he admits that COOLEY did that. He said also that was the same incident where Mike COOLEY spit in Frank Carson's face. He got out of jail on March 26, 2012. Keith Hobbs says, "Do you know what Mike Cooley did to Corey Kaufman?" He hadn't seen Corey Kaufman for some time. He hadn't seen him since he'd gotten out. And Keith Hobbs says that Mike Cooley buried Corey Kaufman in the backyard. I thought it was a bike back there. But he said, Keith Hobbs, this is what he told Kurt Bunch, or Corey Brown and Kurt Bunch and anybody else that was there. He was in jail with Mike Cooley in 2013. They were talking regularly about Corey Kaufman. Mike Cooley blamed everyone else for Corey Kaufman. He said he blamed everybody but himself, including Frank Carson, Jason Armstrong, and some Indian dudes. Everyone, he said, but himself. Mike Cooley had mentioned a hog farm in Sonora. And some of Corey Kaufman's property, namely the bicycle, was still at Mike Cooley's house like a week later. He said it was not adding up to him what Cooley was saying, especially after Keith Hobbs said that Cooley did it. Mike Cooley said he would put money on Hobbs's books. He said he felt he was just trying to remain good buddies. Mike Cooley had borrowed money from Corey Kaufman to buy a car. And he said that Keith Hobbs, this is in the interview that I listened to, Keith Hobbs knew for a fact that Mike Cooley did it. He kept hearing about the hog farm in Sonora, and he didn't have enough time to talk to Keith Hobbs about it while in custody. Apparently Keith Hobbs was in custody for some of that time while he was there. He said that Mike Cooley is an old school convict and knows the game. But when he's on vodka, he gets crazy and he gets wild. Mike Cooley let everyone know that he was buddies with Kurt Bunch. And there was also somebody named Danny, and I have no idea who this is. But he talked about Danny said that he felt Mike Cooley did in Corey Kaufman too. Mike Cooley has bragged about people that he has done in before. And he says there was no doubt in his mind it was either Mike Cooley or Keith Hobbs are the ones that did it. Keith Hobbs has a long history with Charlie ODELL, as does Mike Cooley. Keith Hobbs had stolen from ODELL's wife, but he says they worked it out and they were cool after it later, but he says it's not a cool thing that he did. He didn't go into specifics. Keith Hobbs said they were. He was talking about Keith Hobbs was with him when he picked them up. When Charlie ODELL picked him up in Escalon. But he really has no confirmation of the issues with Corey Kaufman. He said Eula Keys had called him, and he was he thinks it was on McHenry and Escalon by the tractor shop there in Escalon, wherever that is. He says it was at the end of March, because he got out on the 26th of March. It was at the end of the March, and or early April, and it was about 3 o'clock in the morning when they called him. He believes it was on a Thursday, which would make it around the 28th or 29th. When he went to pick them up, they were all muddy, dirty. Mike Cooley said, "That's what the motherfucker gets for playing with my money." And then he said they also said that they had gone to Sonora and said something about a hog farm in Sonora. He talked about, in this interview, he talked about Mike Cooley getting crazy and chasing some guy out of his house, some white guy out of his house, over some antiques. Mike Cooley started losing his associates. Many people quit hanging around Mike Cooley because of the thefts. Charlie ODELL said his wife had heard the stories and wanted him to stay away from Mike Cooley. Now, he said somehow someone had helped Mike Cooley get out of jail. He did not know how, if he bailed or what the situation, but somehow he got out of jail in 2013 when they were in jail together. He said that Keith Hobbs wanted to tell him some facts and talk to him again about what happened. Mike Cooley and Eula Keys they were talking about he was warned to stay away from them by his wife especially, and other people too. John Evers had told him that Mike Cooley and Eula Keys had taken the voice stress analyzer test. And Charlie ODELL said he wanted to take one also to prove he's telling the truth. I noticed John Evers didn't say what the results were. They were talking about some general topics. They go back and forth in these interviews, and they try to loosen you up, and they jump kind of like a cross-examination in court. They bounce around and try to see if you say the same thing over and over again. Evers was asking him about picking him up after coming back from Sonora. Again, it was Eula, Mike, and Keith Hobbs picked up in Escalon, and again, they were dirty. The next recording that they played, there was 2 recordings that they played. This was Kurt Bunch and John Evers at the when ODELL was in prison. I believe he was in Avenal. Kurt Bunch told him that they had found the body, but not where he said by Sonora at a hog farm. ODELL said he had talked to Jack Abel twice. And Kurt Bunch stated that he is telling the DA about Charlie ODELL cooperating with them in this investigation. Kurt Bunch said they have more information from than the last time they talked. And he's been listening to the tear talk, so somehow they're monitoring the tear talk and listening to the jail calls, and they're talking about some other people, some of the information that they've picked up in some of these calls and stuff. They talked about Jack Abel interview, where it was a separate homicide case that Abel was sent there to talk to him about. Corey Kaufman investigation came up, and he said Jack Abel quit writing and just wanted to talk about the Corey Kaufman case. It was Thomas Franks, I believe the name was, that Jack Abel had originally gone there for. Charlie ODELL said he had told Jack Abel that things were stolen, sold, and traded. Kurt Bunch at this time said that he is confident that Mike Cooley is not involved. He knows that the others that are involved. And this is after they found the body, remember. This is in November of 2013. They found the body in August of 2013. He was asking if the Kurt Bunch was asking if the Escalon story was true or not. And Charlie ODELL said he asked Jack Abel if Frank Carson was under investigation. Jack Abel asked him if he knew where the body was, and ODELL said, of course, he didn't. But he did talk about Frank Carson going through the cars at Cooley's, and that a couple times the police had showed up. Oh, something just messed up. I got to straighten it out. And the police had just showed up. Frank Carson was going through Linda Sue Burns' car. This is when he was talking to Kurt Bunch and telling him at Cooley's. He said he kicked Frank Carson in the butt, but then changed it to actually Mike Cooley had actually been the one that kicked Frank Carson in the backside, and then had spit in his face just as the law enforcement was pulling up. He knows Frank Carson from the courthouse and the incident at Cooley's. He says no one from this case has contacted him, but there was a previous interview that year. I guess he's talking about maybe somebody from the events other than Jack Abel. And Jack Abel, he said, only came once. He was shown a picture of someone by the name of Praveen, and Charlie ODELL said he had never seen him. No one else has visited Charlie ODELL to talk to him about this. And Kurt Bunch asked him if he was a member of the Northern Riders prison gang, and he said, no, I'm just running on my own. They were showing him, I guess, quite a few pictures from what it sounded like. People he has not seen before. And he was talking about Praveen Singh and the fraud charges and the bail bond issues going on, where he hired a bail bondman to shoot up a correctional officer's house or something like that. He also talked about Praveen Singh would hire Northern Riders, and they'd hire them to rob the marijuana growers and shoot up a correctional officer's house. Talked about when he was at the Cooley's house, Mike Cooley and Eula and Keith Hobbs and whoever else was there was in the house getting high. He said he had had enough, and he went outside to have a cigarette, and he saw 3 guys working on the fence line. There was a hole apparently under the fence. He said they put a board with some barbed wire or something under the fence. But he did at that time also say that he told Kurt Bunch that he was pretty spun out and he's not sure what happened. Quote unquote. He was shown some other pictures, and he was saying that they look familiar. He's not sure if it was from the yard, but it could have been, but the person looks familiar. At the end of March, or Well, I'm having trouble reading my handwriting again. Oh, this was done. The fence work being done. He saw him with shovels and picks or something. Remember, he was spun out, but he remembers all this. The end of March was when that happened. Could have been the beginning of April. Um, he heard someone saying about trapping someone. Jack Abel was talking about Mike Cooley and his involvement in those remember these interviews really bounce around. That's why sometimes it's not fluent what I'm saying. I'm telling you exactly how it went in court, or in this case on the recording. He said Keith Hobbs told him some things just like Jack Abel was about Cooley. He told Jack Abel about the Escalon thing where he went to pick them up at 3 o'clock in the morning. Apparently they had a fan belt, or one of the belts or something had broken. He also insisted now it was a black car that Eula had, but he keeps saying it was silver in this interview. He said that Thomas Frank's information that Jack Abel initially had come to for was hardly talked about. Once he found out there was Carson information, Jack Abel closed his notebook. He wasn't writing anything down. He was just talking about Corey Kaufman and Frank Carson. He said that Jack Abel would also be able to get him out because Frank Carson is an attorney. He knew that Mike Cooley, Charlie ODELL knew that Mike Cooley was mad at Corey Kaufman in those antiques that he went up and sold, and never came back to give him his money, never came back to the house. And Mike Cooley never received that money from Corey Kaufman. He said he never told Jack Abel about Mike Cooley what he said about Sonora. And he had said he had known Mike Cooley at that time about 14, since he was about 14, which was 21 years at that time, to, a few years more now. After Mike Cooley spit in the face of Frank Carson kept saying, "You guys keep stealing from me. You're a bunch of tweakers, blah, 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 blah. You deserve what you get." He also said that Frank Carson's wife was there too on one of the instances, but now he did say later that it was just, he said a female was there. He doesn't know if it's Frank Carson's wife or not because he doesn't know who she is. Again, he saw Cooley spit in the front face of Frank Carson. That was when he was just pulling up to the house, just prior to law enforcement pulling up also. He said Frank Carson was motherfucking everyone, and he said, "Don't let me catch you on my property." He did say that also at the Cooley's house there was always drama. There was always something going on over there. It was just another day with this type of drama happened at the Cooley house. There was always somebody mad at somebody over there, apparently. And Charlie ODELL told Kurt Bunch that Cooley was behind all the thefts on the Frank Carson property. He was what they call, I think he used the term ringleader or something like that. He also told Kurt Bunch that Mike Cooley said he got rid of somebody. He said Mike Cooley, Eula Keys, and Keith Hobbs, when he picked them up in Escalon, they were pretty well spun. They were smoking dope and hitting it hard. And Keith Hobbs was kind of shook. Mike Cooley never really exactly clarified what he was getting rid of in Sonora, but did say they got rid of somebody, mess with my motherfucking money. Everybody was very dirty, including Eula. They'd been in the dirt and the mud. The car was covered with mud. Eula was not as bad as the others, but Keith Hobbs and Michael Cooley, he says, were covered in mud. And Keith Hobbs later said that they got rid of Corey Kaufman. Eula Keys had told him, I guess he had said something to Eula, and she told him that Hobbs was trying to get rid of COOLEY because they apparently were not getting along, and he said COOLEY was trying to do the same thing to Hobbs. So there was some real issues going on between COOLEY and Hobbs there. And at the end, it says, just another day at the COOLEY house is what it said. That was the end of the recording. Very interesting revelations, I think. Take it for whatever it's worth. I know the jury is going to really be on pins and needles on some of this stuff, and they were earlier today. They weren't listening to those recordings, but if ODELL goes into any denial of anything, then they can play the recordings again in front of the jury. But I doubt if he'll do that. So the jury came up at 3:25. Jai Gohel continued his cross of ODELL, and it was a Corey Brown. The interviews were Corey Brown on February 8th, 2013, then with Kurt Bunch and John Evers on November 18th, 2013. The Corey Brown interview was done, it looked like in an interview room. He was still in custody, so it could have been at the jail. And I believe it was at the jail, but in an interview room. Kurt Bunch, it was done at the state prison at the, I believe it was Avenal. Jai Gohel's asking about in the interview if he ever mentioned two dark-complected individuals that were with Frank Carson. Because that's what he's saying now. In one of the instances, and I forget which one it is now, he said that there was two Hindu or Arabs or Middle Eastern people, males, with Frank Carson. But he never said that in the interview. Charlie ODELL said Frank Carson did say all the tweakers, they always get what they deserve. But he never mentioned that in either interview, Frank Carson saying that. Remember, I just heard both those interviews. He did get out. He said he just got out of jail on 3/26 of 2012. About a week later, he said he saw Corey Kaufman's bike at COOLEY's house, and he had not seen Corey Kaufman since he got out of jail. He was asked. Jai Gohel asked him if he had any discussions in regards to with Mike Cooley and Corey Kaufman. So he did say when he was in the February 8th interview with Corey Brown, he did say when he was in jail with Mike Cooley, Cooley said, "I know that Corey Kaufman is dead and he's buried on a hog farm in Sonora." He said the three Hindus at the Carson property, he saw them after smoking a lot of methamphetamine with Cooley and Keys. And that was in late March, April, or early April of 2012. So it had to be right after he got out of jail. Jai Gohel asked him if those two interviews were prior to him facing 25 to life. Remember, on the 290 registration, which is a registered sex offender, he failed to do, and he was facing 25 to life because of his history and the issues involved. And he had never said these. He was saying these things prior to facing 25 to life. After he interviewed with Steve Jacobson, the story morphed a little bit because he was facing 25 to life, as what Jai Gohel was saying. And he started talking about the beatdowns from Little Jimmy Jackson and all the other people He received all these beatdowns in several days after he mentioned all this, after the 25 to life possibility was there. The Mike Cooley in Escalon with Eula and Keith Hobbs, the mud, the statements about the body, that was all made prior to his 25 to life possibilities. In the preliminary hearing, he was subpoenaed by the defense, but now he's subpoenaed by the prosecution. And just as a note, too, in the preliminary hearing, he refused to testify. Judge Zuniga said she'll force him to, and then never did. So he was sent back to prison when he was in the prelim. He was subpoenaed after the Steve Jacobson interview in light of the assault stories. And that was subpoenaed for the prosecution. That's all Jai Gohel had. Percy Martinez, then after he had some other issues to get cleared up with the judge in his previous cross and wanting him to listen to these recordings, so they came back to Percy Martinez. Again, he asked him if he listened to the interviews, Corey Brown and Kurt Bunch. And the Corey Brown interview, he said it was on 2/8/13, February 8th of 2013. He told Corey Brown it was the Dodge Intrepid with the one that had the dome light on. Now he's saying the Intrepid didn't have a dome light. It was the Monte Carlo that he had that had the dome light. If you didn't shut the doors right, because they were so heavy because of the hydraulics and stuff, or something about the car and the hydraulics he had on the car. He said Linda Sue Burns' car was on the street. His cars were parked in the driveway, and someone was in the car, and he ran over and kicked someone in the butt, and he realized then it was Frank Carson. But now he's saying and admitting that it was actually Mike Cooley that did that, and that's what he said in the interview too. Again, he said Mike Cooley had borrowed money from Corey Kaufman on the bus to the courthouse when they were in custody. On the bus to the courthouse, Mike Cooley said that he knew Corey Kaufman was dead. He knew for a fact that Corey Kaufman was dead, and the body was placed on a hog farm. He got out of custody on March 26, 2012. He told Corey Brown that the Escalon trip was a weekday on a Thursday, but he's not for sure which day it was. He did see Mike Cooley chase a guy at knife point from his house. There's a white guy. And he said that to Kurt Bunch in the November 2013 interview in prison. He talked about Frank Carson and his 84 Monte Carlo with the light on. Saw him going through the vehicles. He had left and went to the store to buy a crack pipe. He came back and he was stopped on the way home. Again, he was reading some transcripts to update himself because he just listened to the recordings, but he's reading the transcript of the recording again to remember what was said. And he came back, and that's when Cooley would spit. He pulled up just as Cooley was spitting in Carson's face. There was a pretty good altercation coming on. About that time, law enforcement pulled up too and separated everybody. He had actually been stopped by the same officer on his way home because he'd made an illegal turn or something. The officer let him go, and then had to leave because he had a call, which was a call at Cooley's house. He was shown a picture of Frank Carson. He knew him from the courthouse, and that incident at Mike Cooley's house. He never told Corey Brown in the interview that he saw him with any Hindus or Arabs or Middle Easterners. He never told Kurt Bunch that he saw Frank Carson with any Hindus, Arabs, or Middle Easterners on the Cooley property. Yeah, he told him he did see 3 Arabs on the back property that day, but could not identify anyone. So, he never told law enforcement officers he saw Frank Carson at all in the back lot. And that was all that Percy Martinez had. And Marlissa Ferreira started her redirect and asked about guns with Frank Carson and Mike Cooley. I don't know where she was going with this. He had him looking at page 35. There was objections. Then they went off to somewhere else. It was really confusing, and I really don't know what happened there. Kurt Bunch interview, he said that Frank Carson had come over, and the second time when he had come back from the liquor store, and that there was 2 Hindus with him. At this point, there was massive objections about all this, and there was a sidebar, and the judge ended up sending the jury out. It was 4 o'clock anyway. So the afternoon session was 35 minutes with the jury, and that was all we have for today. Tomorrow we start at 9, but court's going to shut down at noon. So that's what we have for tomorrow. And remember my PayPal button at the bottom of every report. Remember my sponsors, Doug Maynor, attorney at law at 15th and J Street, Merced Tile Supply in Merced, and remember what I always say, don't take my word for it. Come to court and find out for yourself. It's really getting interesting. Good night, everybody.